Picking up where we left off in the last video, we have this particular mark right now coming out of our liquid ink brush. I'm going to do a Control A and backspace to clear off that layer and just go ahead and hold down Shift and make a mark like so that you can see how this particular stroke looks. You can see there's this sort of broken quality to those. The reason why this is because of the spacing, because remember, these are dabs now. They're not rendered anymore. These are actually dots that are applied. So if we come over here to spacing, and we come over here and we reduce the spacing down to say something closer to around 100, hold down Shift to make a similar mark, you can see the mark is a lot more solid now. It's a lot less broken like what we have here. And the reason why is because the dabs are placed closer together. So my recommendation, generally speaking, is that once you have a good spacing that looks good for your liquid ink brushes, go back and adjust your volume again. So I'm going to go ahead and set the volume back down to say something like 10, hold down Shift to make a mark. And now you're going to see that we're still getting some brokenness, but now we're seeing those individual hairs a little bit better because of the spacing. So I'll go ahead and set the spacing down to say something like 50. Come over here, hold down Shift to make a mark. And what you're going to see is that now it's clogging back up due to the fact that the spacing is compensating for the volume. So when you're thinking about what you're getting from your brush, you want to balance the spacing with the volume and smoothness sliders until you get what you're looking for. Now, the idea here of the smoothness, if I didn't explain it fully before, is that this is going to control the surface tension characteristic. So at a low value, we're not going to have an awful lot of surface tension. But if I come over here and I increase that value up, what you can see is it clogs up and it becomes one big blob because of that surface tension that I was talking about where the droplets coalesce. So the idea here is that if you want to see individual bristles, you want to go ahead and set the smoothness value down to something fairly low. Control A and backspace. In addition, we have for the volume, we have a maximum volume, which is this slider. Then we have a minimum volume slider, and we also have the ability to set expressions if you want to. And then down here, the thickness is something else that's going to have a big impact. The idea here is that this is going to be the thickness of the dabs themselves. So if I go ahead and set this for something higher, you can see everything clogs up again. And the reason why is because the individual dabs are much thicker now. So here what I would need to do is increase the feature so that I can see individual brush hairs again. But now you can see the individual bristles appear to be thicker. The reason why is because of the thickness slider. So the idea here is that if you want to see more of the individual hairs, you would probably want to have the thickness slider lower. Whereas if you want to see less of the individual hairs and more of a blobby stroke, then have the thickness slider higher, and you would adjust the feature to compensate for the thickness. Now the idea of working with this is that then we would think about the way that we want to randomize these brush strokes. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and set the thickness to say 50, and I'm going to go ahead and set the feature down to say something like 5 so that I get a mark that looks like this. Control A and backspace, and then I'll just show you that mark again. So the idea here is that this is a very uniform type of mark in the sense that each and every bristle is exactly the same thickness, and they're all working in exactly the same way. But what we can do is we can randomize the volume and the size of each and every bristle in this brush per stroke. Meaning that if I were to come over here and change the volume jitter up to 100%, there's going to be a randomization between a maximum of 10% and 0% of volume per bristle per stroke. So you can see I get a completely different looking brush stroke in that way. And I can also do something very similar with the size jitter. So here, the size is going to be between the maximum set by the thickness and the minimum of 0 per bristle per stroke. So if we were to combine both of these together, then what we get is a very clumpy type of stroke. And in this way, we can actually increase the maximum thickness, and then we can come over here and decrease the feature down to something like, say, 3 again. And you can see now we're getting a very clumpy type of brush. But what's important to note is that what's happening here is going to change per brush stroke. So it's going to be random every single time that we make a stroke, and we're not going to get the same stroke twice. But this is a very nice clumpy look. Now, in addition to that, we also have the ability to randomize the dabs themselves as they're being placed along that stroke, meaning that each hair can have the individual dabs that make up that hair randomized. So I'm going to come over here and set these both back down to 0 so that we get a very static stroke again. I'm going to come over here and set the volume jitter all the way up to 100%. And now what's going to happen is every dab is going to be randomized between a maximum of 10% and 0% along that stroke. And you can see something looks a lot rougher now. And I can also do the same thing with size. So the size is going to be between the maximum set by the thickness and a minimum of 0 per dab. So you can see that if we were to combine both of these together, we're going to get something that looks very choppy. And this is a way that you can simulate things like paper grain. If you were to combine all of these together, all the randomizers together, what you're going to get is something that's very, very rough. And in this case, you'd probably want to go ahead and set the volume up to something higher so that you can see more results. So the idea of working with the liquid ink again is going to be based around this concept of surface tension and volume, and this is being tracked by that liquid ink layer. If we double click on that, we can see that by simply setting the amount to something higher. Here I'll set it to a volume of 100%, and I'll switch over to a color like gray so that you can see that volume very clearly. And the idea here is that it's tracking that at all times, but we're not necessarily seeing that on our liquid ink layer if we do not have the amount set to something higher than 0. At 0, all we're going to be seeing is a high contrast mark. But the idea here is that it's always tracking that information, and that's ultimately giving us the look that we're getting. But everything that's different about this brush from the original brush that we had over here on our canvas is the idea of the way that those things are being combined with the dabs and the randomization of the size of the dabs per dab or per stroke by these controls right here, the per stroke of volume jitter and size jitter, or the per dab of volume jitter and size jitter. We're also going to be able to do very similar types of things to what we just did with our liquid ink brush when we're working with dynamic speckles. So I'm going to come back over here, I'm going to reset this brush back to its defaults. I'm going to go ahead and close this, make a mark, Control A and backspace, and set my color back to black. And we're going to pick up from this point in the next video.